The French, fueled by dreams of empire and insatiable hunger for resources, descended upon Indochina and stayed for 7 decades. When the time came, they packed up and left like the end of a one-night stand. The question remained, did French rule leave a legacy conducive to prosperity or one of struggle for the newly independent nations? Today, we'll unravel the complex story of Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos and their journeys post-independence, from the grip of colonial exploitation to the trials of nation building and the eventual paths to recovery. We're covering it all. Why should you stay locked in for the entire video? Well, aside from the dramatic shifts these countries dealt with, we'll also uncover the resilience and ingenuity that now define their place in the modern world. It's a story of transformation, filled with challenges, but also brimming with hope. As they awoke to independence, the countries of Indochina found themselves trapped in the remnants of a colonial legacy that was as complex as it was crippling. The French, with their eyes set firmly on the prize of resource extraction, had created a cycle of exploitation and neglect across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos that left behind a legacy of inequality and overwhelming challenges. The French colonists had been very selective in their approach to development, favoring certain regions and resources over others. In Cambodia and Laos, the French saw green gold in the rubber trees, pouring investment into plantations that would feed the insatiable appetite of the industrial world. Meanwhile, Vietnam, with its lush rice fields, found itself on the losing end of this equation. The focus on cash crops meant that essential staples like rice were sidelined, creating an agricultural imbalance that would haunt Vietnam long after the French had left. The French colonial agenda was clear: extract as much as possible, as quickly as possible, which came at a severe cost to the prospects of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The French often only completed infrastructure projects when they served the colonial economy, leaving a huge void where sustainable, local industries should have been. Roads and railways were built to connect mines and plantations to ports, but not to create inter-region connectivity or support local needs. This short-sightedness meant that after becoming independent, these countries had to build economies from the ground up without the foundation of diverse sustainable industries and transportation networks. Perhaps one of the most enduring impacts of French colonial rule was in terms of education. The French designed their educational system in Indochina for 2 reasons. 1. To train a small elite for administrative roles within the colonial government. The other was to assert cultural dominance. This system left a huge majority of the population undereducated and ill-prepared for the demands of a post-colonial economy. As a result, these nations struggled post-independence with economic and infrastructural challenges, along with a critical shortage of skilled labor and intellectuals who could lead the charge toward development. As the sun set on French colonial rule, the countries of Indochina stood at the cusp of a new era, burdened yet resilient. The uneven development, exploitation of resources, and educational inequality left a legacy that would influence their paths to nation building. Scene change. Fast forward to post-independence. The new Indo-Chinese countries were dealing with corruption and poor governance, which greatly stopped their efforts to rebuild from the ruins of colonization. Freedom from colonial rule did not mean freedom from the vices that often go hand in hand with power. In the vacuum left by departing colonial administrations, systems of accountability were weak or non-existent. This environment was ripe for corruption to thrive, siphoning resources away from national development and into the pockets of the elite. Infrastructure projects, essential for these nations' economic revival, were often compromised, delayed, or inflated in cost due to corrupt practices. This eroded public trust in the government and significantly slowed the country's development efforts, setting back their progress by years, if not decades. Another huge obstacle to development was the lack of foresight in planning and policy making. Coming out of the shadows of colonial exploitation, the leadership in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos seemed to focus on immediate gains rather than long-term prosperity. This short-sightedness manifested in various ways, from hasty land reforms that disrupted agricultural productivity to industrial policies that failed to consider the global market. The lack of a strategic vision meant that opportunities for sustainable development were missed, leaving the economies of these countries vulnerable and lagging behind their neighbors. To make things even worse, the bureaucracy was inexperienced. Many of its members were ill-prepared for the complex tasks of running a country. The result was a series of missteps and policies that, while well-intentioned, often led to outcomes that were counterproductive to the nation's development goals. Then there was the conflict. From 1955 to 1975, Vietnam was at the center of a conflict that drew the eyes and forces of the world to its doorsteps: the Vietnam War. The war ravaged the countryside and contaminated the agricultural land with Agent Orange. It tore apart society, claiming an estimated 3.5 million Vietnamese lives. It left the economy and infrastructure in tatters. The war left Vietnam in a state of international isolation, making the road to recovery even more challenging. Between 1975 and 1979, Cambodia fell under the grip of the Khmer Rouge regime, a period marked by one of the most brutal genocides in recent history. Led by Pol Pot, the regime sought to create a classless agrarian society, a romantic ideal that quickly spiraled into a nightmare of mass executions, forced labor, and famine. It's estimated that between 1.5 to 3 million people perished during these 4 years, leaving the country scarred and its population traumatized. The end of the Khmer Rouge regime left Cambodia in ruins, with its societal structures dismantled and its economy devastated. Less known, but equally impactful, was the Laotian Civil War, which lasted from 1953 to 1975. This conflict was closely tied to the Vietnam War, with Laos becoming a battleground for the communist forces and those supported by the United States. This included a secret bombing campaign that left the country as one of the most bombed per capita in history. The war disrupted traditional ways of life, displaced thousands, and left the country littered with unexploded bombs which continue to threaten rural populations. Reports state that more than 350,000 people died in this war. Post-war Laos faced the daunting task of reconciliation and rebuilding. Outside of the human issues, there were also natural problems that the government just couldn't deal with. Vietnam's geography is a mix of diversity and strategic potential, with its extensive coastline stretching over 3,000 kilometers along the South China Sea. It holds the key to major maritime trade routes that have historically enriched its economy. The country includes fertile deltas like the Red River and the Mekong, alongside towering mountains and rolling plains. This varied topography has blessed Vietnam with many natural resources, including oil reserves off its coast, rich mineral deposits, expansive forests, and land perfect for farming that's the envy of its neighbors. Cambodia's story centers around the mighty Mekong River, around which much of its geography and resources are based. Dominated by the Mekong Delta region, the country's landscape is mostly flat, although there are some mountainous areas and a limited coastline. This geographical setting has made Cambodia rich in timber, minerals, and fisheries, resources that have been both a blessing and a curse for its development. The fertile lands of the Mekong Delta have supported agriculture and livelihoods for centuries. However, the country's limited access to the sea and reliance on a few key resources have meant that it's struggled to diversify its economy. Laos is a landlocked nation, and it's a clear example of how a country's geography can affect its destiny. Surrounded by mountains and crisscrossed by the Mekong River and its tributaries, Laos's topography has stunning natural beauty, but this is also a significant obstacle to its development and trade. While within its mountainous terrain lies treasure, huge forests, and massive mineral deposits, the lack of direct access to international waters has historically isolated Laos economically, making it dependent on its immediate neighbors for access to global markets. All three countries definitely had their own challenges, whether it was Cambodia's struggles with its geography, Laos's difficulties to rebuild, or Vietnam's success. They all had their own stories. Fast forward to today, and things seem to be quite different. Vietnam's rise to becoming one of Southeast Asia's most dynamic economies is nothing short of remarkable. In recent years, the country has moved towards developing its manufacturing capabilities, which has significantly helped its economic growth. This shift has diversified Vietnam's economy and made it an attractive place for foreign investment. Many international companies, in a bid to reduce the risks from the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on global supply chains, are now diversifying their manufacturing bases away from China, with Vietnam becoming a favored destination. While Vietnam strides ahead, Cambodia and Laos continue their struggle against economic hardship. Currently, they rank as two of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, with its rich cultural heritage and natural beauty, has long relied on tourism as a key part of its economy. However, this dependency has also made it vulnerable, something clearly shown by the COVID-19 pandemic. Laos, on the other hand, faces the geographical challenge of being landlocked, which has traditionally limited its access to trade and economic opportunities. However, by focusing on sustainable resource management and regional integration, Laos can overcome its geographical constraints and build a more resilient economy. As we finish this journey, let's remember that the former Indochina is a vibrant region, poised on the brink of a promising future. The paths of these nations towards development and prosperity are filled with challenges, but they are also full of opportunities. By learning from the past and looking towards the future with optimism and resolve, Indochina can continue to create its story of transformation and resilience.